Thank you. So thank you very much to Sibylla and Jason and Annalise for having me here. It's a great pleasure. I'm a big fan of Global Blake, so it's an honor to be here. And thank you very much for this opportunity. So in this presentation, I examine the metaphor of mental parturition in Blake's early work. More precisely, I begin with a visual expression of this metaphor by comparing the frontispieces of Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, and then turn to the Book of Urizen, where Blake stages two contrasting and yet interconnected acts of mental generation. Urizen's unprolific and at the same time prolific creation, and Loss's painful, problematic, imaginative birth. The Book of Urizen is deeply entangled with contemporary embryological discourse. As Shah has noted, the 18th century witnessed an, quote, eroticization of the brain, unquote, where mind, imagination, and mental activity were interpreted in sexualized terms. Within this context, Blake's myth dramatizes the generative crisis that arises when reason is severed or diverges from imagination, and the redemptive potential of visionary creation. Before diving into this topic, into the topic of today's talk, I want to briefly situate my research, of which this talk is part. I'm currently, as Sibylla said, I'm currently working on a monograph on the metaphor of mental parturition in Blake's work. So the comparison between the pregnant body and the pregnant mind has deep historical roots, extending from mythology, such as the birth of Athena from Zeus' head, to philosophy, notably Plato's Symposium and Phaedrus, to classical literature and beyond. The metaphor persisted through the Renaissance and gained renewed prominence in the Romantic period, where, as Terry Castle observes, childbearing becomes an archetype for poetic process. This aligns with Erasmus Darwin and his theory of paternal imagination, when he states that the real power of imagination in the act of generation belongs solely to the male. In the chapter of the conception of On Animal Generation, William Harvey marked a turning point in the reimagining of the brain-womb relationship. He proposed a homology between the uterus and the brain, comparing the substance of the uterus ready for conception to the constitution of the brain, and arguing that the former was structurally and functionally analogous to the latter. This analogy not only inverted prior hierarchies, but reimagined the generative organ as isomorphic, destabilizing the gendered conceptions of intellectual and biological productivity and giving rise to the idea of the brain child. Harvey's claim accords with the symbolic and anatomical lexicon that began to encode the brain in maternal terms. Medieval and early modern anatomists, drawing on classical and Arabic sources, described the brain's cavities as ventricles, derived from Latin venter, meaning little belly or womb. Likewise, the brain's protective membranes, called the pia mater and dura mater, meant tender mother and hard mother, respectively, metaphoric designations that recast the brain as a site of gestation and nurture. In parallel, folklore and humoral cosmologies associated the womb with cavernous, circulus, and concave forms, features that mirror the architecture of the cranial interior. In my research, I show how Blake both employs and departs from these paradigms through his distinctive interdisciplinary approach. This includes his engagement with contemporary debates on generation and embryology, which were reshaping the notion of organic life, particularly within the framework of epigenesis, the process by which cells differentiate and organs develop, as well as discourses on female agency. I argue that Blake uses the metaphor of mental parturition as an integrated epistemological tool, one that expresses both the embodied nature of imagination as a human faculty and its transcendent potential as a vehicle for divine vision. This metaphor finds a further echo in Blake's dialogical mode of addressing the reader, reminiscent of Socrates' maiotic method, which draws one of the earliest analogies between the birthing of ideas and the delivering of a baby, the Greek term maiotic translating to of midwifery. Just as a midwife aids in physical birth, the Socratic method aids in the birth of intellectual thought, helping others to articulate their own ideas and beliefs. The purpose of this approach is not to lead the conversation towards a predetermined conclusion, but rather to encourage individuals to examine their own beliefs critically and to assess the validity of their claims. In this light, Blake himself can be considered a man midwife, assisting not only his characters, but his readers as well in birthing and nurturing their own ideas through imagination. Now, having established this necessary background, we can begin our exploration. In 1794, Blake composed the Songs of Experience and the Book of Urizen. Though they differ greatly in tone and scope, they are linked by a shared concern with the origins of inspiration and vision. I suggest that the metaphor of mental parturition provides a visual and conceptual thread between these works. Let us consider the frontispieces of Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. In Songs of Innocence, we see a shepherd piper in a pastoral setting with a child, perhaps an angel, hovering just above his head. In the Songs of Experience, the frontispiece, the child now seems to sit atop the shepherd's piper's head. The figure transforms into an externalized symbol of the brainchild, a manifestation of inspiration or imaginative conception. Here, imagination is both divine and embodied, an operation that collapses the boundary between interior and exterior, mind and world. This early visual articulation of mental parturition in the songs serves as a quiet prelude to the paroxysmal mythopoietic process that unfolds in the first book of Urizen. Where the song evoked the birth of imagination in a world of gentle pastoral beauty, the Book of Urizen reimagines that emergence as a violent and catastrophic rupture. Here, the birth engendered by the mind becomes an existential trauma. Reason seeks to regenerate itself in isolation, severed from the imaginative other. The result is a fractured, confined, and inert world, where even imagination's fertility appears tainted by this condition. In this context, Blake's engagement with contemporary theories of embryology comes to the fore, as the act of creation is recast as a failed or arrested gestation. What had appeared as a cherub delicately perched on the piper's head in the songs becomes, in the Book of Urizen, a malformed, petrific chaos struggling to assume form or a painful severance from the innermost self. Divided into 9 chapters, the poem introduces Urizen's first manifestation as a fallen Zoa in his 9-4 Darkness Unseen, precisely in line 9. His attempt to generate a world through rigid singularity reduces creation to a mechanistic imitation of divine order. In this process, the biblical decalogue transforms into a novelogue as the 10 commandments become 9. 1 command, 1 joy, 1 desire, 1 curse, 1 weight, 1 measure, 1 king, 1 God, 1 law. This insistence on the number 9 both evokes and parodies human gestation, establishing an expectation of Urizen's generation that ultimately remains unfulfilled. Indeed, Urizen, whose very act of generation is predicated on the workings of reason, is paradoxically given birth to a world that lacks true generative power. Unlike the biblical act of creation, which brings the universe into being from a true nothingness, ex nihilo, Urizen's creation is doomed from the outset because it arises from a void that is already laden with emptiness. This distinction is crucial. Creation out of nothing implies an active generative force, while creation out of the void suggests an impotent attempt to impose form upon an already existing space, although empty. At its best, Eurysense is a demiurge, not a god. As noted in the preludium to the book of Eurysen, Eurysen is hurled into a place in the north, obscure, shadowy, void, solitary, a location that reflects the limitations of his creative capacity. Unlike the biblical God who creates in a state of boundless potential, Eurysen is constrained by the very nature of the void into which he is cast. Blake's repeated invocation of the void throughout the text, appearing 12 times alongside terms such as vacuum and voidness, emphasizes the persistent failure of Eurysen's creative powers. These terms conjure an image of a space that is not only empty, but actively resistant to transformation. The use of adjectives such as immense, unfathomable, and fathomless further underscores the vastness and intractability of this void, illustrating its refusal to be tamed or filled, condemning Eurysen to an endless horror vacui. As the poem progresses, however, the boundaries between inside and outside begin to blur, revealing the void not as an external force, but as an intrinsic part of Eurysen's being, as if he had absorbed the void, or been absorbed by it, or even fully assimilated into it. In chapter 1, the narrative voice asks, what demon hath formed this abominable void, this soul-shattering vacuum? Some said it is Eurysen. When comparing this question with what is stated in the preludium, it becomes clear that the void is consubstantial to Eurysen's form and operates as the only space Eurysen can inhabit. First, I fought with fire, consumed inwards into deep worlds within, a void immense, wild, dark, and deep, where nothing was, nature's wide womb. Commenting on these lines, Stephanie Engelstein maintains that through his prolific desire, Eurysen impregnates this void, which is himself, with the world, and with a host of living forms. I would argue, however, that Eurysen's self-impregnation, confined within the limits of logical processes, ultimately fails to realize true generative potential. The forms that Eurysen generates, rather than manifesting as fully developed living entities, remain trapped in a life-in-death condition, existing only as, quote, ruinous fragments of life, end quote. This is Eurysen's paradox. As Mitchell has observed, he enacts simultaneously creation and anti-creation, form and anti-form, which fuses, quote, the stasis and death with those of motion and fecund multiplicity. Consider how Eurysen's world appears as a dark globe, in contrast to Los's globe of lifeblood, from which Enitharmon is born. It is her womb, not Eurysen's, that, quote, wore an enormous race, end quote. Indeed, while Eurysen's creation of a universe of beast, bird, fish, serpent, and element is certainly enacted, it must also be re-enacted by Los and Enitharmon, who bring forth a similar world of fish, bird, and beast. But now, the worm within Enitharmon's womb will epigenetically develop into an infant form, orc. The semantic continuity established between Eurysen's deep world within, the void immense, and nature's wide womb suggests that these spaces are superimposable and interchangeable, forming what might be called Eurysen's perverse syllogism. Perverse, as Shah notes, meaning a turning aside from what is true or right. Nature's womb in its homology with the void is internalized within Eurysen's mind, becoming the point of origin from which, like a Cartesian cogito, all things proceed. In her book chapter, A Womb of His Own, Catherine Eisman Maus explores the metaphor of mental impregnation and parturition, emphasizing the significance of its inherent hiddenness in a way that strongly echoes Urizen's deep world within. The womb becomes the private space of thoughts, yet unuttered, actions yet unexecuted. It is a container, itself concealed deep within the body, with something further hidden within it, an enclosed, invisible organ, working by means unseeable by and uncontrollable from the outside. In Urizen's case, what is unuttered and unexecuted attempts to emerge from his womb, void, world within, but to do so would mean to reach for the outside world. Yet there is no outside, as nothing exists beyond his mind. His parturition, rather than being a birth into the world, becomes a deeper withdrawal into his mind. Urizen's generation entails not only contraction, but also a process of englobing and folding, and, to borrow a term from the developmental biology, of invagination, a turning inward that in Urizen's case pointedly results in no organic development. Invagination is a crucial folding process in early embryonic development, where the blastula, a hollow sphere of cells, force inward to create multiple layers. This produces the gastrula, which contains 2 or 3 distinct cell layers that develop into specific structures: the neural tube, head, eyes, mouth, and limbs. Caspar Friedrich Wolff, in his 1759 theory of generation, noted that cells or globules arrange themselves in layers and suggested that organisms develop through a series of steps as cells gradually differentiate and form organs. He attributed this development to what he called vis essentialis, an essential force. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach later refined this concept in his 1780 work, An Essay on Generation. There he introduced the notion of Bildungstrieb, or formative drive, as a developmental force present in all organisms. Although lacking organic development, Urizen's ninefold darkness is reminiscent of these layers, whose unfolding enable his mental parturition when the will of the immortal expanded or contracted is all flexible senses and eternal life sprung. Indeed, the expansion and contraction of the flexible senses mimic the early stages of parturition. During this time, the muscles of the uterus tighten and relax to assist in the baby's birth. Yet, in Urizen's case, this mechanical rhythm leads not to organic emergence, but to a confused and obstructed environment, now filled with clouds, darkness, and waters that rolled perplexed, laboring, and uttered the words articulate. The proximity of laboring, carrying the latent meaning of birthing and uttering, suggests a semantic closeness, as if laboring generates utterance, with Urizen's parturition producing words as its offspring, uttered words articulate. Here, words articulate means not only that words should become intelligible in utterance, but that they might develop and organize into coherent sentences, ideally culminating in the Book of Brass. In biological terms, organization refers to the hierarchy of complex systems and structures, such as the cell, the fundamental unit of life that sustain vital processes and enable the formation of organs. Urizen endeavors to transform the act of language formation into an epigenetic process, where language itself evolves and dictates the structure of reality. In Genesis, creation is an act of logos. God speaks the world into being. In his fallen mimicry of divine authority, Urizen attempts to reproduce this generative utterance through his Book of Eternal Brass, as codified articulations of reasons meant to instantiate and order the material world. However, rather than expanding thought, this book entraps the life it strives to create, proving his mental parturition to be an abortion. Consider the background in plate 1 of Urizen. It depicts stone tablets that, while they echo Moses' tablets received from God, they also evoke tombstone, suggesting that these book children are indeed stillborn. It is profoundly ironic, then, that Urizen, the figure most closely aligned with rationality, law, and the logos, should fail in his act of mental parturition. His attempt to generate a world through reason alone yields not creation, but catastrophic fragmentation. This infertile imagination is reinforced through the image of a womb that, rather than initiating life, petrifies its surroundings. And a roof vast petrific around, on all sides he framed, like a womb, where thousands of rivers and veins of blood pour down the mountains to cool, like a human heart struggling and beating, the vast world of Urizen appeared. In plate 10, Urizen is drawn into a cavernous roof that simultaneously acts as both a womb and a reflection of his mind. The irony becomes even sharper in the last line when we read that the vast world of Urizen appeared. This vast world exists entirely within Urizen. Perhaps its immensity is less a reality than a delusion of his own mind. Or it is a reality insofar as we inhabit Urizen's mindscape. The cavern Urizen enters also echoing Plato's myth of the cave. If we read Urizen's creation through an embryological lens, its limitations become immediately apparent. The form he brings forth fail to develop into fully living organisms. Urizen himself is described as, quote, laid in a stony sleep, unorganized, end quote. Since, as we have seen, organization is the precondition for the emergence of life, Urizen's unorganized existence testifies to a privation of the formative principle itself. He is arrested in a state of potentiality, incapable of actualizing life into determinate and vital form. I argue that loss in molding Urizen into a humanoid form, organizing him organ by organ, sets into motion a process akin to embryonic development and gives poetic body to Blumenbach's formative drive. Imagination emerges as the vital force, not merely generating life, but shaping, ordering, and propelling it into dynamic being. Loss then undergoes his own mental parturition. In plate 17, we witness the appearance of a fetus suspended within a globe of lifeblood, likely the nascent Enitharmon, whose development, as Denise Gigante has shown, follows an epigenetic trajectory. Paradoxically, it is through loss that Urizen's unprolific creation becomes fully prolific. Loss's presence in the Book of Urizen echoes Christ's descent into the mortal world, a redemptive intervention that turns Urizen's fall into a kind of felix culpa. Like Milton's Theodicy, this fortunate fall makes imaginative creation possible. Generation does not originate in the faculty of reason, which abstracts and categorizes, but in imagination. An imagination grounded not in conceptual utterance, but in the poetic word. And this can only be the work of Loss, who, as Elizabeth Effinger argues, becomes, quote, the locus of creative agency, end quote. As Heidegger reminds us, poetry is, quote, the saying of being, end quote, the site where truth happens. Only poetic language has the power to enact poiesis in its fullest sense, not merely to represent, but to bring forth, to disclose. In this light, poetry becomes an ontological necessity. It is the very mode through which creation comes into appearance. In Loss, the word is not a sign, but a seed. It does not signify, but begets. Thus, poetry becomes not expression, but birth, not meaning, but making. To conclude, I want to consider a passage at the end of chapter 8 of the Book of Urizen, where Blake employs once more the language of mental generation, this time to describe the birth of the net of religion. He refers to it as a female embryo enrooted in the human brain, thus producing a complex symbolic condensation that brings together the divergent generative processes of both Urizen and loss. On one level, the net of religion as ideologized, institutionalized belief is clearly an extension of Urizen's mental parturition. It is the logical outcome of his compulsion to measure, legislate, and impose rational structure upon the formless unknown. As we have seen, Urizen's creativity is sterile. It seeks not to generate, but to contain, not to reveal, but to obscure. The net of religion is thus the ideological web spun from the very filaments of his reasonings, a structure that pretends to order, but actually ensnares. Yet, Blake's use of the term female embryo complicates this Urizenic lineage. It gestures towards Enitharmon, who emerges from loss in a moment of imaginative though painful birth. It also aligns with Enitharmon's role as the female will in Europe, the first work Blake composed in 1794. Thus, if the embryo takes on characteristics of Enitharmon type, then this net is not Urizen's alone. It is perhaps unsettlingly the product of the imagination itself. The female embryo, Enitharmon type, represents the imagination as turned inward, folded into time and space and the structures of morality. What Blake shows us then is that imagination, if not continually regenerated by prophetic vision, may become complicit in its own perversion. Loss's generative act is not immune to distortion. The very force that should oppose Urizen may inadvertently contribute to the structures it seeks to dismantle. Mental parturition, when severed from the unity of the divine human, can yield not liberation, but imprisonment. In the figure of the female embryo implanted in the brain, Blake gives us an image of how false religion and morality may all begin, not in external tyranny, but in the mind's own betrayal of its own visionary power, the mind-forged manacles. And yet, the very act of showing us this, of drawing the mind's complicity into the light, is Blake's redemptive gesture and apocalypse in the true sense, a maiotic revelation. For even within the net, there is a call to break it, to remember that imagination, though vulnerable to corruption, is also the only force capable of regeneration. Thank you.